And in this interview, he says, quote, "Science is 99% failure, and that's an optimistic view." In fact, he says at the end of the year, he reviews his lab's results, and if there's too much success, I'm not a happy person. It means we're not asking the right questions. That's the kind of attitude that you need to see throughout scientific leadership, is that if you're not failing at least some of the time, then you're not asking ambitious questions. You're doing the equivalent of maybe like a high school chemistry experiment where it's already been done a million times and we all know the answer. If you're doing ambitious science or interesting science, like there should be some failure, and we should be able to talk about that. Mm.
Today, I'm speaking with Stuart Buck. Stuart formerly was vice president of Arnold Ventures, where he focused on scientific reproducibility and funded important work to demonstrate its lack across various scientific domains. He now runs the Good Science Project, which engages in communications and public advocacy toward improving the funding and practice of science, largely through encouraging greater experimentation and extensive data collection. Among other things, we discuss Stuart's theory of social change, the double-edged role of models and metaphors in science, as well as potential causes of grantmakers' increasing conservatism. Without further ado, I hope you enjoy our conversation. So, Stuart, thanks so much for being here today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
To start us off, is there a thread in your career, and how might that thread be articulated? How does the Good Science Project fit into those efforts?
Sure. Well, it's been a long road in getting here. So, if you went back and looked at my entire history, I started out as a classical guitarist and then went to law school like many liberal arts graduates do, and then was unsatisfied with practicing law, and so got a PhD. And then ended up turning into philanthropy around in 2012 or so. And so I worked for the Arnold Foundation, which is now known as Arnold Ventures. And so that's kind of where the thread began of like really trying to promote good research and good evidence. So the Arnold Foundation in its early days and to this day is very interested in promoting evidence-based policy across a number of areas, including criminal justice reform and education. And so when I came aboard in 2012, we started to notice the looming issue of reproducibility, first in psychology and then in medicine, and pretty much any area you look at, there are folks who will say that there are lots of problems with the publication process, that people care more about getting something published than getting it right, which is what one psychologist, Brian Nosek, is fond of saying. And so it became for the Arnolds this question of like, how do we promote evidence-based policy if we're not sure what the evidence is, or we're not sure when we can trust the evidence or how the evidence has been produced. So I embarked on a kind of grant-making program that over the years gave out grants, probably 60 million or more, to promote open science and to promote reproducibility. And then that carried forward to what I launched almost 2 years ago now, called the Good Science Project, which is a small think tank focused on trying to improve federal science funding and science policy, again, to promote everything from reproducibility to faster innovation, more effective programs, and just a better overall R&D ecosystem.
Yeah. So implicit in that form of work, there seems to be a theory of social change. Could you concretely speak to that theory? How do you think social change actually happens? And how has that maybe evolved from the early days of Arnold to what you're doing now?
That's a great question. How does social change happen? I think it, you could think of social change as involving both top-down and bottom-up processes. So I do think both are really necessary, and that kind of a bottoms-up grassroots approach is often foundational. So there are any number of examples you could give where someone manages to get some sort of top-down policy enacted, but there isn't a lot of like grassroots support for it, and so then people end up evading it or circumventing it. So, for example, I'll just give a concrete example. There's a federal law in 2007 that said that any clinical trial in the U.S. that's being used to get FDA approval for a drug or treatment, and that's funded by NIH, these clinical trials should be registered in advance on a website called clinicaltrials.gov, and then they should go back and report the results after the trial is done. And so that's a great policy in theory, but there have been any number of times when people go back and check, are these clinical trials actually reporting results? And oftentimes they'll find that a lot of clinical trials just don't report the results. That can happen for any number of reasons, kind of bureaucratic inertia, or maybe a clinical trial failed and no one is following up on it, or no one's enforcing this policy. But getting a top-down policy enacted is sometimes, just the start of like trying to actually see social change happen. And if the people in a given field aren't, compliant, or just basically refuse to go along, it's kind of hard to really force behavior like that. So I do think that some type of like grassroots, bottoms up approach is also necessary, and I think we've seen that, for example, in psychology. There, you could imagine a policy, for example, with the National Science Foundation, NSF, that funds some psychology research. You can imagine policies there to try to promote reproducibility. But I do think that one thing that's been successful in psychology is the formation of grassroots organizations like the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science, known as SIPS. That's a grassroots organization with a lot of early career researchers who come together and talk about how to improve their day-to-day work. And so there's this feeling that we're all in this together, and that this promotion of better work at early career stage, that will eventually bubble up into, as these researchers become more senior and more established, that will help create change within psychology. So yeah, I think it's kind of a mix of top-down, bottoms-up approaches, and it is tempting to try to start at the top and think, okay, I've got a great idea. If I could just force everyone to adopt this, then that would be great. But like, we live in a world where it's not always possible to just enforce your own wishes on other people. You have to get buy-in and support. So I do think that that requires a mix of approaches.
Yeah. For that, I guess a follow-up would be, are there particular areas or problems where there's a top-down component and also a bottom-up component, and where they kind of meet? Like, have you seen any projects where both of these components kind of like had to work together, and like what might be like the intersection point of that? How have people dealt with that?
I mean, if you take a kind of multi-decade view of history, like, so there's been an issue about sharing scientific data, sharing data that supports publications, or even just sharing data that's produced by a lab, even if it's not part of a publication. And that's an idea that's been out there. I mean, really, like the kind of history of science is basically the idea that, like, whether you believe something should not just happen because some authority says so, but because you've produced data and evidence and experiments and all the rest, and other people can double check your work. They can see it for themselves. They can replicate it, hopefully. So that's kind of inherent in the very idea of having science, as opposed to other forms of authority or knowledge about the world. But in implementation, it's often fallen short. And so the ways in which people share data or don't share data have evolved over time. And I think technology has made data sharing much easier over time. So with the advent of the internet, and that became much more commonly available in the 90s. So then you started to see certain scientific fields. Genetics was a leader, for example, that started to say, look, we should just share our data openly, or as openly as we can, with each other. And so I would say genetics was an early leader. And then other fields, through fits and starts, have started trying to share more data. The NIH currently sponsors several dozen data repositories, some of which are kind of generalized, some of which are specialized, and there are other places that try to share data or provide platforms for sharing data as well. And so I think that's been met with efforts to require sharing of data. So the internet and data repositories, that makes it possible. It becomes more normative through fields evolving practices and kind of preferences for, like, this is how we should share data. And then it's kind of met at a final stage with policy implementation. So the NIH spent several years working on a data sharing mandate that just finally went into effect in January of this year. And so now we have what hopefully is kind of aggressive top-down policy. And again, it remains to be seen how well that will be implemented, because one aspect of this new data sharing rule is that scientists have to share data even if it doesn't appear in a publication. How exactly the NIH is going to enforce that, how exactly people are going to comply with that,
Yeah.
is kind of an open question.
Mm. Yeah. What's the perhaps most impactful, relatively feasible, low-hanging fruit type of incentive change that, in your view, could improve the efficacy of scientific research? You could pick anything, but like what's out there right now that maybe good science can't really, work on given, its limitations or its focus, but what are you like wishing for another person to tackle or another organization?
Interesting. Well, so I mean, there are a couple aspects to your question. What, like, I think you said, what's one of the most practical things, or did you say intensive social change? Like
Impactful, relatively
impactful. Okay.
feasible. Yeah. Like what's the low hanging
Impactful,
fruit
feasible.
where a small change could yield potentially a great outcome? If there is any such thing that's come to view for you in the past few months, years.
Ah, that's a great question. I mean, I'm almost tempted to say that, the low hanging fruit uh, is maybe difficult in this area because, if there were low hanging fruit, then I would expect it might to have been picked before now. But um, I do think that, like, there are areas where we could improve just the overall production of meta-science, so to speak. So the process by which scientists who are kind of external to, let's say, the NIH or the NSF are able to study those processes and to see how they work and to see what best impact science. So on that meta point, I do think one area where we could do a lot better, and that wouldn't be that hard compared to a lot of other ideas, would be just for organizations like NIH and NSF to do a better job of sharing their internal data with external researchers. And they do this sometimes, once in a while, but it's not common enough. And I know some, frankly, some top researchers in the field who typically don't want to be named out of fear of antagonizing NIH, but who have been frustrated that they can't get access to data on things like peer review scores. They like to study questions like, well, how does peer review handle certain types of proposals? And you would just need to get access to the anonymized scores. And that's something that I think we could do a much better job of making that more available to outside researchers, economists, sociologists, public policy scholars, folks that want to just do some meta scientific examination of how NIH makes decisions and possibly recommendations of how those decisions could be changed or improved or at least experimented with. We could do more internal experimentation with government agencies. That's another possibility that I think is out there, and NSF is talking about doing things like that. So yeah, more experimentation at government agencies and more access to those agencies' internal data, I think, are a couple of ways in which we've seen a little bit of progress, and I think we could do a lot more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if institutional risk aversion is getting worse, which I suppose I'd be curious to hear your comment on in the first place, whether you share that sentiment, but it's often like I feel like a stock phrase, like or a stock take in the meta science circles. If that's actually getting worse, what would you recommend a young researcher intending to pursue an ambitious long-term project? Where should they go? Whom should they talk to? I'm sure this differs from field to field or problem to problem even, but is there some, as generalizable as it is even possible to give an answer to that? Is there
Right.
anything that you would recommend them? And yeah, I suppose as a
Hmm.
follow-up, whether that answer has changed at all from since you started working in meta science. Like, have there
Well, I
been
can
new
say that
efforts?
that it does seem to have changed in terms of options or that are available to a young researcher who maybe needs funding. I think there's been a lot more philanthropic interest in promoting new and different ways of doing science in recent years, and so um, you've seen organizations like Schmidt Futures sponsoring focused research organizations, which are these kind of startup organizations that are centered around one particular scientific goal, and they have a kind of short-term mission-driven approach. So there's a number of these that have been set up. Um, there are new organizations like the ARC Institute, sponsored by the Collisons and a number of other philanthropists. There's Arcadia Science. There's this kind of upswelling of philanthropic interest in promoting new and different ways of doing science, and it's not totally discontinuous with the past. I mean, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, for example, has had a history of sponsoring uh, top researchers to have more creativity and flexibility in their work by just giving them kind of open-ended grants. But yeah, I think there are a growing number of private opportunities. And then within government, I mean, I think it's been interesting to see such a push to have like a DARPA for everything, or an ARPA, I should say, without the defense component. So there was ARPA H, the idea of an ARPA for health. There's been ARPA E for energy, ARPA I infrastructure. Another ARPA E is an idea for education. So I think these sorts of ARPA-like initiatives, or at least have the ambition of saying we want to pursue aggressive, high-risk projects, and we expect there to be some failures. So don't come with your safe incremental ideas. So yeah, the young ambitious researchers might find more opportunities with those types of initiatives as well. But I do think that we need some kind of similarly minded effort with regard to basic science. So the ARPA mindset or mission is that you have some like specific targetable goal that might be very aggressive, whether it's creating new forms of cryptography or self-driving cars, to name some things that DARPA itself has worked on. There's some specific goal. You put out this aggressive goal. You get different researchers, or in the ARPA lingo, performers. And you hold them to a bunch of aggressive milestones, and you really try to push for progress on the specific goal. But I do think that within the area of basic research, like it can't be that goal-driven or a kind of mission-driven. I mean, part of the whole process of basic research is that it's curiosity-driven, and that it's unpredictable where it's going to lead. There may be researchers studying some obscure bacteria and bacterial defense mechanisms in the early 90s, or that are studying it in yogurt in the early 2000s, and then it turns into CRISPR, which is something no one had expected, right? And so I think that being able to fund, we need space within our funding system to let aggressive, ambitious researchers do something that maybe seems irrelevant to everyone else at the time. And so that's, I think in a broad scientific ecosystem, we need some ARPAs that are like really mission driven and milestone driven, and we need some space for researchers to just explore the universe and follow their curiosity and follow their nose where it leads. So we need some balance there.
Yeah, and perhaps this is, I don't know, I'm expecting too much of a narrative rather than acknowledging that oftentimes there's just seeping change informing these things. But when and why might have grant makers become more conservative in funding these kinds of basic, if we want to draw that distinction? I know you have your gripes with like the basic and applied science distinction in the first place, but when have they become more conservative in funding that basic science? And do you see that kind of tied? This is something I've just been curious about for myself for a while. Has it been kind of tied to broader cultural shifts of wanting kind of incremental, safe, quantifiable, like measurable impact, rather than kind of like giving someone like a pretty long leash and letting them work in obscurity potentially for a few years? Like, do you feel like there's just historical currents or cultural currents in the past that have kind of caused this?
That's interesting. I mean, I do think it's been a problem for a long time. I mean, there was some major reports on peer review out of NIH in the 1970s, where they talked to a lot of scientists, and scientists had some complaints that they still have today, which is that the peer review process seems to focus on safe, conservative science that seems guaranteed to work. Maybe there's something kind of inherent to large bureaucracies that kind of veers towards what's safe. I mean, it's kind of the scientific parallel of like, you can't get fired for hiring IBM or McKinsey. We want some big established entity that seems safe to do whatever project we have in mind, whether it's for business or for science, where we can kind of guarantee that it will have good results. Or if it doesn't, well, it's not our fault. Well, if it was IBM, or we funded Harvard. Like who could complain that we funded the safe thing? So yeah, I think that impulse might be there in large bureaucracies, and so I think that people are at the top of those bureaucracies have to bend over backwards to protect people that work for them, and like funding outside the box ideas. And so it's kind of a constant struggle. Like the I don't know, like the struggle against erosion or the struggle against like, your driveway getting dirty. I mean, it's like a constant struggle to try to like maintain a good system and not let it fall into just the patterns of like safe incremental, uh, the typical bureaucratic thing to do over time. Um, so yeah, I think that's one element of it. I do think that politics plays into it too, especially when you're talking about like federal funders. There have been politicians over the years who, sometimes will target various funding agencies for ridicule by holding up some research project that they think is frivolous, which in some cases it may be frivolous, but then they'll hold that up for kind of ridicule in a congressional context, for example. And so that's also, I think, a component of why sometimes people at funding agencies are a little bit nervous about being too outside the box. So yeah, it's a political decision too. So politicians, like in the case of DARPA, I think why DARPA has been successful is that politicians, for whatever reason, gave it enough of a free rein that that DARPA felt empowered to take on huge risks, and then DARPA has ultimately had some successes that they're then able to point to as kind of protection against all the other times that they might have quote unquote failed. So yeah, I do think that that's possibly one hopeful element of the push for ARPAs in other areas is that maybe politicians could get more accustomed to the idea that just because someone funds something that seems ridiculous or high risk, it doesn't mean that that's a bad decision as part of an overall portfolio, and so you shouldn't hold that one decision up as something to be ridiculed.
Yeah, yeah. And one of my favorite phrases that I came upon in preparation for this was a post of yours that questioned the validity of our common distinction between basic and applied research. You're right, metaphors and models matter after all. They can open our minds and policies to better ways of doing science, or they can be an obstacle to good science. So, from your vantage point, are there other contingent metaphors and models that stuck in science funding and organizing? Perhaps even like any essays, books, proposals, a la Vannevar Bush's Endless Frontiers memo that policymakers found and then built downstream models upon that now feel like very ingrained just in the process of how science functions.
Yeah, so I think you're drawing from an essay I wrote about a year ago or more on like the distinction between basic and applied science, and I think that was um, kind of drawn from this insight that basic and applied are not necessarily like totally disentangled in practice. That there are all kinds of examples from scientific history where a basic science project might lead to an applied insight, and that applied insight might also circle back and provide further opportunities for basic research and so forth. And so it's really kind of a integrated cycle of discovery over time. And so yeah, maybe that article was a little more philosophical nature, I guess, but it's arguing that we don't necessarily need to divide everything up into basic versus applied. I mean, there's literally an NIH webpage that I saw once that tried to classify every NIH grant as either basic or applied, basically, and it's I think it said 51% are basic, 49% applied, and that seems like a little too binary for me. That and in fact, the reality of probably a lot of those grants is that they have some component of both. Maybe they're doing basic research at the moment, but it might lead to an applied discovery that then turns into a biotech firm and so forth. So yeah, I think it's useful to break down these kind of categories that where we're trying to put everything into some kind of like predetermined box and say, well, your science is X versus somebody else's science is Y. I think the world isn't quite as clean cut as that.
Yeah, yeah. Is there anything else that you feel like is harming the way that grant makers or researchers, it could really be anywhere within kind of the institutions of science, kind of think about their work, where it's like metaphors that they're implicitly using that you've come across, or kind of similar like clean cut distinctions that don't quite apply?
Yeah. So I think like the notion of failure in science is something we really need to think about or question, just like the very word failure or failed science. So in fact, I'll just quote from, there was a recent profile of the Nobel Prize winner Catalin Carrico in Glamour magazine, of all places. And it had this great quote from her. And so if you don't mind, I'll just read a quote from the article that then quotes Carrico. So it says, Carrico knows her peers. Scientists build an experiment and expect a certain result. When the process doesn't net out as planned, it's a disappointment. It's a waste of time and resources. Or at least that's how other people think about it. Quote, it seems that the experiment doesn't work, she tells me. Incorrect. The experiment was in fact a success. It succeeded in showing the scientist how inaccurate her assumptions were. So I really like that quote, and I in fact posted it on Twitter and said, look, we need more of this attitude in science. And so, yeah, I mean, to just expand on that, I mean, I think this whole notion of failed experiments is kind of a misleading category. I mean, there are reasons that an experiment can fail. Maybe you just like didn't set it up properly, and the thing, it got ruined, right? I don't think, but that's not the type of failure we're talking about. We're talking about failure where you're studying a particular idea, you hope that a particular hypothesis pans out, or you're interested in that, and then it turns out that that hypothesis did not work, or maybe you're testing a treatment for a disease and the treatment didn't work, and that's maybe disappointing. I mean, it'd be better to be able to treat the disease than not, but it also is scientific progress to learn, okay, this is a treatment that does not in fact work. And so that maybe means that either my model of how the disease can be treated needs to be updated, or my model of how this drug works needs to be updated. But as Carrico says, from that quote unquote failure, you should still be able to learn something, and the field should be able to learn something. And so, I think we need to really think about what do we even mean when we say failure in science, and we need to be much more tolerant of the kinds of quote unquote failure where the results just didn't turn out as expected, but that's still progress, and it harms a field if we aren't allowed to see as many of those negative or null results, and thereby update our information on those. So yeah, that's definitely like the metaphor of failure is one that I would want a lot more scientists to question, to think about, like Carrico does.
Yeah. And then as a follow-up to that, do you feel like there's institutional roles in also updating kind of their conception of failure? Because obviously if you're a scientist and you're even like very pro failure in terms of learning something from the fact that you failed, you can be as optimistic as you want, but ultimately if you're not like publishing or getting tenure, like hitting like very measurable metrics, it might be hard for you to advance just in your career as a scientist, right? Do you feel like there's a role for institutions to kind of like update their view of failure, or allow scientists to kind of like claim like a more optimistic notion toward failure? And what might these institutional changes look like in a world in which the NIH had a positive view of failure, would abandon the idea of failure, kind of, or update it in the way that you just described? How might things look differently? Like what structures might change?
Right. I mean, again, if we talk about failure in the sense of just null results, I think that agencies like NIH should positively, or should actually expect a certain rate of failure in that sense, and then in fact it's a sign of it should be a sign of suspicion if some researcher or some grant making program has too many successes, as in like everything we study, it all works, like it always proves our hypothesis. Like that's just not that. Like the only way you can get to that point is either by studying topics where you already know the answer and it's already like very safe and incremental, or just by shoving all your null results under the carpet and not telling anyone about them, and just in essence almost, I would argue, being dishonest. Like in fact, like there have been a number of scientific frauds that have been discovered in a number of fields, and it's interesting how like the response from their colleagues after the fact, after the fraud is uncovered, is often something like, wow, I always thought that guy was like just amazing because he always came up with such positive, exciting results. I'm like, how did he do that? Well, yeah, he was committing fraud. He's falsifying the data. But that should be a sign of suspicion. Maybe the one initial sign of fraud is like someone is just too consistently churning out exciting results all the time. And of course, it's possible that they might be doing that legitimately, but I would argue that like potential frauds like that's what their pattern of publication looks like. Um, so yeah, when it comes to failure, I think we need to expect some rate of null results. I mean, what that rate should be is a good question. So there's another interview that I'm fond of with Robert Lefkowitz, who won the Nobel Prize in 2012. And in this interview, he says, quote, "Science is 99% failure, and that's an optimistic view." In fact, he says at the end of the year, he reviews his lab's results, and if there's too much success, I'm not a happy person. It means we're not asking the right questions. So I think that's the kind of attitude that you need to see throughout scientific leadership. Is that if you're not failing at least some of the time, then you're not asking ambitious questions, or you're doing the equivalent of maybe like a high school chemistry experiment where it's already been done a million times and we all know the answer. Like
Mm-hmm.
if you're doing ambitious science or interesting science, like there should be some failure, and we should be able to talk about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another piece of yours describes the need for a funding agency to look at their anti-portfolio of sorts. That is the proposals that were rejected but turned out to yield important results down the line. I'll quote the questions that you pose. Can we explain at a level beyond random noise why opportunities were missed? Were there any key predictors available at the time that could have been recognized by funders? Or was it just the luck of the draw? Either finding would be useful. So I'm curious, I know you didn't publish this too long ago, but have there been attempts to do this since or even before that kind of motivated you to write this? Can you speak to any patterns that we've found of what makes an agency kind of reject
Not, I
given
don't really
premises?
know of any efforts so far to do this. I would love to see it go forward. Now the idea of an anti-portfolio, I'll admit, I got that from Michael Nielsen. And in fact, I just recently saw a Michael Nielsen post on Twitter where he pointed out that he pointed out to this article in Glamour, which is where I found that. But he pointed out that someone at the University of Pennsylvania, it mentions in this article, is going to give a lecture on like, why did I miss the fact that Carrico was a great scientist, and why did Pennsylvania like essentially try to push her out the door? But Nielsen also points out that it's interesting that Pennsylvania, the University of Pennsylvania as a whole, it hasn't been asking that question as far as he can tell, nor has NIH, at least not in any official capacity or official report. And it should be a time of soul searching for organizations like NIH or Pennsylvania. Here's somebody who was doing work that would one day win the Nobel Prize, and yet you wouldn't fund it, and you tried to get her fired. Like, how is that not an occasion to go back and take a look at why were we making decisions that way? Now, what I say in the piece is that, look, it's quite possible that this is just an anecdote. Like there are many other anecdotes that are kind of similar, and it's possible that like any decision making system, you're going to have like false positives, false negatives, type 1, type 2 errors. So folks at universities and NIH might indeed logically make the claim that, look, any decisions that we make, we make tens of thousands of decisions a year. Like you're always going to be able to go back and say, look, you should have made one decision differently. And that's a fair point. And that's why I suggested we need more than just the, anecdotes, even if there are dozens of anecdotes. We need some more systematic look at, the decision-making process that led up to these anecdotes. Were they indeed systematically preferring certain types of research, and were there things they could have noticed about the future Nobel winning work at the time, given what they knew? So without the benefit of hindsight, it's easy to identify Nobel winning work when you already know that they won the Nobel Prize, but it's a little harder to identify it 15 years in advance, perhaps. So yeah, I'm arguing that we should go back and try to look at what did people know at the time, and were they in fact systematically biased? It would be good to have kind of empirical, systematic evidence on that point. So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Still hoping somebody does that.
Yeah. No, I'd be very curious to hear like the results of that if anyone's ever like doing a longer kind of write up or study of it. What's the implicit knowledge?
Well, that's one of the questions, by the way, that would require in NIH's case someone to have a lot of access to detailed data on their internal procedures and on peer review scores and on the proposals that went unfunded and so forth. So going back to my earlier point, like, you really need a lot more independent access to that kind of data. So it's not just, I mean, I worry a little bit about agencies evaluating themselves because there's always going to be kind of a conflict of interest in that case. I mean, whether it's NIH, NSF, Department of Energy, you name it. If the idea is, well, we as an agency, we're going to go back and evaluate ourselves and how well we did, I kind of worry that they, for political reasons, might be reluctant to publicize or even like come to some sort of finding that we indeed failed in our own internal procedures. So yeah, I do think you need kind of independent scrutiny for those types of questions.
Yeah. Are you aware of where one would even go to kind of collect this? Like what kind of shape is this like repository of, like failed or rejected proposals and such like taking on? Like, is there just like one, like corner of the NIH, one, like branch of it, where, a meta science motivated person would go and kind of like knock on the door and demand some data?
Yeah, so like let me see. I think it's called Impact 2. I think the NIH has some internal database that researchers will occasionally get access to, and but yeah, not nearly enough to. I mean, so I've heard it referred to as like getting behind the firewall. So they have, I guess, some firewall externally, and that once you get behind the firewall, then that means you're on the inside and you have access. Yeah. So yeah, I actually don't know how far back the data goes. I'd have to look into that, but yeah, it would be whatever they have. It'd be great to have more ready and available access to external researchers.
Mm-hmm. And within meta science, what's the implicit knowledge that you feel holds true generally, but is not explicitly stated? What has to be learned anew through experience by everyone kind of entering the area with no good reason? Could be written down perhaps, and I know you're doing a ton of that work, or shared more publicly in general. Do you feel like there's still anything that you wish you would have known, or that seems like obvious to know and not so obvious why it wouldn't be shared more publicly?
Within meta science, what's implicit? I might have to think about that some more. I'm not off the top of my head. I'm not sure. So maybe that's not the best answer, but
Oh, that's right. We can also come back to that, or yeah, you can link something if you end up having anything. If there is one, and this is also not necessarily going to yield an answer, but if there's a disagreement between you and the people that you work with, what might that be? Like a main disagreement, the contentious topic that you always return to when you're working on the Good Science
disagreement
project.
between me and who?
The people that you work with.
The people I work with, as in
At the Good Science project.
Sorry?
Yeah, work for you, or even the investors that you work with, like anything in the capacity of the Good Science project.
It's interesting. Like one disagreement that I had so there was someone who works at the NIH. I won't name who it was because we were just having a private conversation at this conference of the National Academies. But yeah, we ended up having a disagreement about the value of replication, or about the value of funding replications. And I have a history at Arnold of funding some replication experiments. So like the psychology project that tried to replicate 100 experiments that was published in 2015 and found only around 35-40% that could be truly successfully replicated. Then a similar project in cancer biology, where the Center for Open Science also tried to replicate 50 cancer biology papers, and for reasons relating to the quality of the literature, they could only get to, I think, around 23, because just the literature is like impossible to even try to replicate unless you like contact the original lab and they tell you what they really did. So it became a much more difficult process than anyone imagined. So yeah, I mean, having had that experience, I think that funding some replication experiments is valuable for a lot of reasons. But yeah, I got some pushback from this person at NIH that this person said something along the lines of, Like, what do we really learn from replications? I mean, a lot of studies don't work out for any number of reasons, and um, studies are hard, and uh, it's better just for us to fund basically work that tries to extend and build upon prior work, and not spend time on direct replications. And I just fundamentally disagree with that. I think that there obviously most of what NIH does is going to be extending or creating new work, but to say that we should fund zero replications, to me, that just I just can't really agree with that. I think that we do learn a lot from the effort to replicate studies. I mean, the cancer biology case, we learned that the quality of the literature is just inadequate. Like, you literally cannot read a paper, at least any of the papers that they read, and or in the message sections or whatever, and you can't even try to replicate it. And if you can't even try to replicate it, my question is, how would you build on that? How would you extend that work in a new direction if you don't even know enough about the original experiment in the first place? So it seems to me that kind of falls apart, like the idea that we should just extend previous experiments rather than replicate. And the effort to replicate showed that you don't even know what happened in that original experiment. All you know is the polished version that was whatever made it into the actual paper. And then I do think from failed replications, there's been this argument that, well, when replications fail, you're still in a state of uncertainty. Like, it could just be that the replicators weren't as good, or they weren't as skilled, or whereas the NIH person said experiments are really hard, and so you're going to fail a lot of the time. So what do you really learn from a failed replication? And I mean, there's something to that. I mean, it's possible the replicators in any given case aren't very good, but I do think that, like, one of the most common excuses made, whether it's in cancer biology or psychology or whatever, one of the most common excuses for a failed replication is, well, you changed something, like you did it in a slightly different time or context. You did the psychology experiment in a particular setting that was somehow different from the original one, and there was this hidden factor that explains why the experiment might turn out one way in one setting and one way in a different setting. And my response to that is, well, maybe that's true, but it seems to me that's something we ought to know about. Like, again, anyone who wants to build on a prior experiment and who is blindsided by the fact that it only works in one setting and not the other, like that's something they ought to have known about. And also, by the way, if the precise setting and circumstances and context and time are also crucially important to that experiment being quote unquote successful in the first place, then maybe scientists ought to be more circumspect when they talk about their original study. In the case of psychology, like, maybe if all you've done is study 100 undergrads in Florida, maybe you shouldn't then like write a best-selling book or give a TED talk on how we now have this theory of human nature. Especially if it's going to turn out that when someone replicates your study in Virginia, it comes out to a different result, and your excuse is, well, of course, it was a Virginia town and not the Florida college town. Like, that seems maybe you don't have a truly generalizable theory of human nature at that point. You're just like quibbling about details. So it seems to me that you do learn a lot from replication, or the attempt to directly replicate. And I find it honestly just kind of mystifying that people think, no, let's do zero of them. Like, let's not bother with it at all. Even when we're spending $50 billion on a research program, like, we shouldn't have anything go towards trying to directly replicate and see whether stuff is true or whether it's variable from different settings to another. So that's been one disagreement I've had.
Yeah, I know we're running out of time, but I just wanted to ask lastly, are there any important topics that we didn't get to, something pressing that you'd like to kind of like extend as a tangent? Any kind of important questions that I haven't asked of you today?
Yeah, I mean, there are some big questions, and I don't claim to have the answers, but I mean that about what we should even be measuring about science in the first place. I think there's a big kind of measurement problem. So there's a lot of meta science studies that focus on citations, citation patterns over a scientist's lifetime, et cetera, or that focus on patents as a kind of indicator of whether innovation is happening in a field or not. And I think that those metrics are useful to some extent, but they're also flawed in many ways, and they don't necessarily correlate with perfectly with what we might actually want out of science. I think that a lot of times what we want out of science is kind of unpredictable and maybe unmeasurable in the short term, or else we need some thought about how we could better predict, longer term success. So I refer to, basic science as being something that often, one discovery that seems irrelevant, will cause a field to change, and then there will be a flourishing of new discoveries and building on it, and then decades later it will turn out that indeed that original discovery was really, really useful. So I think we need better ways of thinking about how do we even measure and predict that kind of thing in advance, if it's possible at all, and how do we best do meta-science? Again, to harken back to something Michael Nielsen has said, how do we best do meta-science if our goal is to produce a slightly higher rate of outliers, like scientific geniuses whose creativity is allowed to flourish? And how do we produce, let's just say an Einstein every 5 years rather than every 10 years, or something like that? How do we increase the rate of outliers? And that's kind of hard to measure. It's hard to measure in the short term. And if all you do is focus on overall metrics like average citations and patents and that kind of thing, it could be almost counterproductive sometimes, because again, you get a large bureaucracy that's focused on short-term metrics. They can end up kind of flattening out what the possibilities of what everyone is allowed to do, and so it might inadvertently squelch the outliers who want to do something different, or that isn't as easily measurable in the short term. So yeah, I do think that there's some kind of deep, not fully explored questions of like, how do we even measure scientific output so that we maximize what we want to maximize and not do something that's inadvertently counterproductive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much for talking today, Stuart. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I enjoyed it as well.